Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the musical theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, we are plowing through the Tonys on tour.
We are indeed. So this is the 10th one, I believe.
Sounds right.
Sounds about right. So today we do Parade, which wins a Tony Award for Best Revival, correct?
That's right, exactly.
Parade's been around for a while, but it has kind of resurged into our musical theater consciousness and is now touring the U.S. and actually just made its first stop in Atlanta, very near to it's
Ground Zero.
Yeah. It's the first time that it has toured through Atlanta at the beginning of this month. So it came through the 4th, 5th, and 6th, I believe, of this month, and there was a lot to be said about it. So I get to share some of that.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll save that for later, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. Well, that's going to be interesting to hear. I actually lived in Atlanta when Parade premiered in 1998. I had spent that summer interning in Atlanta. Yeah. So I have a couple of reasons why that's not why, but I do have a couple of reasons why Parade was pivotal in my life for a number of reasons. I'm going to share those right now. Number one, I don't know if you remember Audra McDonald's Way Back to Paradise album, her debut solo album. Okay, so this came out in September of 98. And it came out in an era when I used to go to Barnes and Noble and they would have, like those sampler CDs, like, the new releases would be on the back wall and you could listen to them. And I was constantly looking for new things to put in my giant binders, right? I needed to fill those giant binders. We haven't talked about
that binder in a while.
Yeah, I think it's been since the last episode, since the binders have come up.
Oh my.
But one of the ways that I filled the giant binders was I would go to Barnes and Noble and go to the back of the store where they had all these CDs on the wall and these little listening stations, and I would listen. And I will never forget Audra McDonald's Way Back to Paradise CD being one of those new releases on the wall. And I, put on the headphones, and as soon as she starts singing,
oh, it's gorgeous.
Oh my gosh. Oh my God. I'm still weak in the knees thinking about it, obviously. And so I was, a college junior, maybe a senior. I think I was a senior at that point. And I immediately bought it, go home. Well, as part of that CD, the project was she wanted to highlight the work of young composers. And so there was a lot of like Adam Gettle and Michael John LaSouza songs. And then there was You Don't Know This Man from Parade, which had not yet hit Broadway. So it was written by Jason Robert Brown. And it was, the show didn't open on Broadway until December of that year. So she, I got a little jump on it when I really began to fall in love with Audra McDonald, who I knew from Ragtime, right? I was in love with her, but man, did it really deepen with that Way Back to Paradise album. So it had You Don't Know This Man from Parade, which was an early taste of the show that was to come a few months later. Now, secondly, spring break of 1999, my parents took me to New York. This was not long after they took me to the Tony Awards for your
21st birthday. I was like, how? I was like, wait a minute, this is very okay. This is really close to when you were.
Right, it was. It was.
Parents, please tell me they really love Broadway as well.
They do.
Otherwise, they were just actually, like, we just love you, and we're
no. My dad especially, he would go to New York for work and still does, and would see shows, and then would come back and tell us about it. So yeah, he and Mom loved him as well. So no, I was not dragging them, kicking and screaming. I promise. They enjoyed it as much as I did. But nevertheless, in February of 99, which was when Furman's spring break was, we go to New York because I'm looking for apartments because I'm planning to move to New York and be a performer after college. And we've already discussed, I don't have the chops for that, but at that time I had not yet realized that.
Yeah.
So
we all did it.
Yeah, we've all been there, right? We all have that moment. Well, this was kind of that moment for me. A friend of my dad's sister happened to be, not my dad's sister, a friend of my dad had a sister who happened to be in the original company of Parade. And that friend of my dad connected his sister with me. And when we were up there for spring break, she was so gracious and she went to lunch with me and she let me walk around with her on the stage at Lincoln Center. And
Oh.
she answered my questions about the life of a performer. And I will never, ever forget what she said to me.
Mhm.
She said, if you love this so much that you can do nothing else, then do it.
Mhm.
But if there is anything else on this planet that you can do and be just as happy,
Mhm.
do that.
Yeah.
And that, I think it's advice a lot of us have been given.
Mhm.
But when she gave it to me, it opened my eyes.
Yeah.
And I began to think, is there something else that I can do that can fulfill me just as much as I think performing for the rest of my life will fulfill me? And so I always think back to this show, which we saw later that same night, as kind of a turning point for me. So I have very strong associations with
Mhm.
Parade, even though I wouldn't necessarily say it's, at the top of my list of favorite shows, right? So,
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm with you.
yeah.
It was, I, it's not quite the same watershed moment for me, but it's the first one when listened to the soundtrack for the first time and I went, oh, there's depth in the music of Broadway,
Oh, yeah.
and so, and being as it was, there wasn't a lot of musical theater programs when we were going to
No,
school,
that's
so you
right.
had to do like a
That's
theater
right.
degree and then try to like cobble together.
Specialize. Yeah.
Because there wasn't, there weren't a lot. There were maybe three.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting a music degree and having to take music theory and composition and all the things and being able to recognize that in Jason Robert Brown's work I was like, oh, we are turning a corner.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. 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 I mean, the style of his music was so broad in that show. I mean, there was like a gospel. I mean, he just really captured what felt very, very familiar to me as a child of the South, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing because he is not a child of the South, right? He
Mm-hmm.
grew up in New York. So, very different experiences, but nevertheless, he really captured the sound with gospel and bluegrass. And I mean, I remember that opening number, The Old Red Hills of Home,
Oh
and
my
just getting,
gosh.
getting goosebumps,
Well, I mean, and that's the one I'm talking about where it's like
Yeah.
you hear something, but the band, the parade band that he
Yeah.
works into the orchestration, because the first time you hear it, you're like, oh gosh, something horrible has happened to the orchestra.
Yes.
They're not
Yes.
together. They're not, oh gosh. And then it's like, oh no, you're here, you're kind of going back in time,
Yeah.
forward and back
Yep.
so that you
Yep.
hear the parade kind of coming. And I was like, that was brilliant. That was
Yeah.
absolutely brilliant. Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And what's hard is that it's like I've seen lots of people try to like do the show now, and it's like it takes a large group of really great musicians to pull it off. It's hard to do, but when you get it, it's amazing.
It is amazing. And it's hard to watch. I mean, it's
Oh,
kind of like watching The Diary of Anne Frank. I mean,
yes.
it's not just because they have the same name, but because it's the similar feeling of we know the end, right? There is
Hmm.
no escaping what happens at the end of this story, and you dread
Yeah.
it.
But the thing is that most people don't know.
Well, that's true.
And a lot of people had no idea what they were walking into. I sure didn't the first
Yeah.
time. And it was one of those experiences where it said parade on the outside. And
Right.
parade means something to me very different than it did before.
Yeah.
And this musical was kind of the first time where I was like, oh, this is not where I thought this was going.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
like, oh dear, there's a lot more here than I knew. I mean, and that's partly because of how I try to experience musicals. I try to
Right.
like know nothing about them so that I remember kind of, that
experience.
spark and the experience.
Yeah.
But it was jarring. And a lot of the feedback that we got in Atlanta this month. It's not last month. It's still this month. Oh, good. 3 weeks ago was just a lot of people being like, I think you need bigger like content warnings on this show.
Oh, yeah.
Because they do have a couple content warnings for like racism and I forget what the article said. They had like racism and something else, but they didn't tell you that it dealt with like a child dies,
Yeah.
and that this is a true story, and that there's lynching involved. Like there's all of these different things, and people were, people thought they were going to a fun musical. And it
Yeah.
is, I mean, fun is a relative word, right?
Yeah.
But they thought they were going to something that was, about a parade,
Yeah.
and it it does what a musical is supposed to do. I'm going to
You
use
know,
that line.
you
I'm
know,
going to
I
use
love
that
that
line.
one. You know, I love that drowsy
I know.
chaperone
Drowsy chaperone.
epithet.
It does what a musical is supposed to do. It surprises you. It makes you think, everybody is awestruck as they leave that theater. It's silent, but
Yeah.
there's conversation in the car, and that it stays with you. That's what the musical is supposed to do. That's why it is kind of the bedrock of our kind of American artistic output. it,
Hmm.
it it does what it's supposed to do. It's a big one though,
Yeah, it
and that
is.
probably does account for some of the reason why it didn't do as well up front, and is
Yeah.
maybe doing a little better now because more people had experience with it the
Right.
second time around. So
Yeah, and I think a lot of those songs, like Audra McDonald had kind of previewed one on that album I
mhm,
talked about. A lot of those songs have kind of lived in the cabaret review. You know what I mean? Like they've
mhm,
lived and so we're a little bit more familiar with some of it. But today, as we begin our conversation about Parade, I'm going to do something that I don't typically do. And it's for a lot of the reasons you just described. I'm going to tell the story of Leo Frank in
okay,
brief, but nevertheless, I'm going to tell it. Which again, I don't typically get into plot and all of that, but I think this is helpful.
mhm,
You're absolutely right. This is not a parade as in an Easter parade or a parade as in till the parade passes by from Hello Dolly. This parade, when they pick that title, it was because the motif that kind of runs through the show is the Memorial or Confederate Memorial Day parade, right?
mhm.
And that's when this action is all centered. So that's why parade, popped out as a theme and as ultimately the title. But let me talk now about the story of Parade for those who aren't familiar with it, because I was not familiar with it. And like I said, I lived in Atlanta at the time that this show moved into Broadway, and I knew nothing about it. So, although subsequently, once I learned about it, I did go find some of the spots in Marietta, which is the particular suburb of
Mhm.
Atlanta where a lot of this action took place.
Which is only about 25 minutes from where I live right now.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. So,
Atlanta's big, y'all.
Atlanta is
You
Atlanta
don't you
is
don't
big.
realize it how big it is. It is very big.
Yes, it is big, and it's getting bigger. It's getting bigger.
Uh-huh.
So at any rate, let's talk about Parade. Now, the central figure of Parade is a man named Leo Frank, who was born in 1884 in Texas. And not long after that, when he was about 3 months old, his family moved to Brooklyn in New York. He was raised there. He ended up getting a degree from Cornell in 1906. And not long after that, he moves to Atlanta. And there's a couple of reasons why he moved to Atlanta. Number one was he got married, and it was basically an arranged marriage. He married a woman named Lucille Seelig, who was a part of the Jewish community in Atlanta. And Frank, coming from the Jewish community in New York, this match was made for them, and they marry. Also, he has a position as the manager of the National Pencil Factory, which was, as we said, in Marietta, Georgia. So that's Leo Frank. And this happens. I read a couple of different dates about when he moved to Atlanta. I read 1909, I read 1910. Take your
Somewhere
pick,
around
but it's
there.
around then, right?
Yeah.
It's around then. The next big player that I want to introduce here is Mary Fagan. Mary Fagan was a 13-year-old girl who worked at the factory. And in April of 1913, like I said, the events happening around the timing of that Confederate Memorial Day parade, her body was found in the basement. She had been raped and strangled. And, obviously a murder investigation ensues. Leo Frank is pretty quickly convicted with very flimsy evidence, and he is sentenced to death. But after a couple of years, the governor of Georgia reviews the case, and it was really Lucille, Leo's wife, who kept pushing for this review. And so a couple years after Frank is sentenced to death, the governor reviews the case and realizes, hey, this is pretty flimsy, right? We really don't have much on this guy to prove that he did this crime. So I'm going to commute his sentence. He didn't release him. He didn't let him have a retrial, but he did commute his sentence. And there were some discussions of an appeal. But then some, there's no other word for them, but vigilantes took things in their own hands not long after that sentence was commuted, and the appeal is beginning to, or the potential of an appeal is beginning to make some waves, and the news of that is spreading around. About 25 men kidnapped Frank from his prison. They called themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, which may give you some insight into maybe some groups that they were in alignment with. They drove him from his prison about 150 miles back to the Atlanta area, where they hung him from a tree. And they stuck around long enough after they had hung him and took a photograph with the body hanging from that tree, which is horrifying. Not beyond horrifying. No one, of course, has been charged in that kidnapping. I don't even know that they worked real hard to find anyone, but at any rate, that's what happened with Leo Frank. So, Tracey, what are you thinking?
That's the story that is told very much from the perspective that Kristin just told it in the musical.
Yes.
One of the things that I do want to break up is that in Atlanta, that is not how they tell the story.
Right.
There is still a large part of the population that believed that Leo Frank was guilty and that this was appropriate. This was an appropriate action. Mary Fagan's great niece, I'm going to get her name right. Hold on, making sure that I have it. Her name is Mary Fagan Keene, is one of a good portion of that family that is still in the Atlanta area, I believe, who still believes in the guilt of Leo Frank. Dismisses all the work that historians have done about other possible suspects, and runs a website in Mary Fagan's name, and says, we've done our research as well, and this is, we're trying to let a guilty man off, basically.
Yeah.
That was a huge part of the discussion when the show comes to Atlanta, because there is, it's not the first time, obviously, that they've done the show here, but it's the first time we've ever had a touring, like a Broadway level touring company come through. And so every single bit of publicity, every single bit, like all of the criticism, all of them have to mention the fact that it's like, this is what the show says. We understand that this is still not a closed case. Apparently, in 1986, they did cleared Leo Frank of this particular crime here in the Atlanta area. And then the DA actually opened a case to discover who the actual killer was in the information that I have. There is no information forthcoming.
Yeah.
So they know that it's like, sometimes it kind of feels like we've opened a case to figure that out, but they know that there's not any.
Are there any witnesses coming forward?
No one's coming forward.
Right.
We have that aspect of it, but it is. I don't know of another musical whose story could be this contested. It really is contested. And the funny thing is that everywhere else in the country just thinks, oh, this is a story of injustice. Yeah. And that's it, cut and dry. Everybody believes that, but they don't. And that brings that tension in this musical up just a little bit. So
yeah. No, and I'm really glad you brought that up. And there are a number if you go looking for them, if you're interested in hearing the other side of the matter,
Mm-hmm.
um, there are ways, like there's some great podcasts that have done some deep dives into that, you can find if you look for them, that have looked at kind of the con side of the case, which is no, Leo Frank was absolutely guilty. So you can make your own conclusions on that. But Tracy's absolutely right. The creators went with this telling of the story, and
And it is the one that most legal scholars and
right.
most historians, most of the it's the story that Georgia like is the official story in Georgia
Right.
as well. Like as far as legality is concerned, it
Right.
is the story, but it is very contested. So
Yeah. And it's instructive to remember that, just like with the telling of history, the telling of musical theater plots depends on who's writing it, right? So it's instructive. But just one other point that I want to make about it, because I think this is really interesting. The governor who commuted the sentence to life in prison rather than execution lost his next election. And guess who he lost to? That would be the attorney who had prosecuted Leo Frank in the first place. So I think that's interesting. Now, in the aftermath of this occurrence, a couple of things happen. One is we have the development of the Anti-Defamation League, which of course continues to this day to combat anti-Semitism. But we also see the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. So, there's some good and very bad that come out of this, right? In addition to those things, we see that this story captivates the imagination of many, many different audiences throughout the next century. It actually reminded me of your conversation about true crime when we were talking about Chicago, right? This would have been that same, 1913 is when this happened. He's convicted.
The same area, yeah. I mean,
That's right.
The same
1915 is when Leo Frank is lynched. Chicago happens in 1920. Well, 1924 is when those stories happen. The play hits Broadway 1926. So we're in the same epic, right? That people are putting true crime stories into theater.
But notice how regionalized it is. And I know we've talked about this before. The United States, it's really hard to find something that touches everybody.
Yeah.
Because we are so regionalized.
Yeah.
Even in those moments, Chicago, the upper half of the country, knew a lot, got a lot of play with those murders before it was a musical.
Yeah.
The South knew all about Leo Frank. And I mean, growing up in California, I'd never heard of him. Not once.
Yeah, right.
So,
well, I'll tell you what, growing up in the South, I'd never heard of him. I mean, it was 100 years removed, basically, not 100, but a lot of years, decades removed. So that was brand new to me when I heard that Audra McDonald album, but it nevertheless it's not because it wasn't out there. It just somehow I had missed it. There was a 1936 novel called Death in the Deep South by Ward Green, which formed the basis of a 1937 film called They Won't Forget, which starred Lana Turner. This one was pretty fictionalized, but nevertheless, it really gave the essence of the story and introduced it to people who went to the film. Then there was a 1977 novel called Members of the Tribe, and a 1988 miniseries which starred Jack Lemmon, which was called The Murder of Mary Fagan. Then there was a 1997 novel. Again, this was highly fictionalized by David Mamet. It was called The Old Religion. And then there's a documentary style book called And the Dead Shall Rise, which is written in 2004 by a journalist named Steve Oney. And then between that 1997 novel and that 2004 documentary style book, we have The Story of the Hour, which is the 1998 musical Parade, with a book by Alfred Urey, who came up with the idea. So let's talk a little bit about Alfred Urey, because that name may or may not be familiar with musical theater audiences. He's certainly written some musicals like The Robber Bridegroom, but that's not necessarily one that a lot of people just know, right? And unless you're deep into the canon, you don't really know The Robber Bridegroom. So let's talk about Alfred Urey.
in other ways.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. There are other things that he's done he's better known for. But Alfred Urey was born in 1936, grew up in Atlanta. So this was of real particular interest to him for a couple of reasons that we'll get into. But he was the son of a social worker and an artist, his dad was a furniture designer. And he was also very much a part of that Jewish community, which to this day thrives in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
There is a huge Jewish community in Atlanta. After high school I believe he went to Druid Hills High School, which is near the Decatur, not too far from Emory, if you know Atlanta. It's kind of in that area. He attended Brown University, where he wrote a couple of musicals for their student-run theater group. And then he starts writing lyrics for Frank Lesser, which is probably a name people are familiar with, right? Frank Lesser, who had written Guys and Dolls, plus the Pulitzer Prize winning How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. He works, in addition to writing musicals, he's also a music publisher. And so Alfred Urey becomes a lyric writer for, I think it's Frank Music Company. I think that's what Frank Lesser's company was called. It started out as like Susan Publications and was named for his daughter, and then becomes Frank Music Company, which it remains today. That is such a rabbit trail we don't need to roll down. But at any rate, he writes music for Frank Lesser's publishing company. And then he starts adapting musicals. He starts writing lyrics for musicals. And one of the first is an adaptation of John Steinbeck's novel, East of Eden. That show is called Here's Where I Belong. It premieres on Broadway in 1968 and runs, Tracey, for one performance.
Okay, I was like, for an hour?
Right.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, one performance. And, there's another one that I actually didn't even put on the list. He did an update of Little Johnny Jones by George M. Cohan.
Are you serious?
He updated the book for that in like 1982 for a production that starred, I think, Donny Osmond and ran for one performance.
So for those of you that are like, why would anybody just close it after one performance? It's technically more than just one performance.
Right. There are previews that lead up to that.
There are previews and everything. Right. And the ones that they know are not going to do well because of how the preview audiences worked. When they get to opening night and then they close, it's so that everybody who worked on it can say, I got to Broadway.
Right.
So that happens more than you realize.
And it almost happened to The Wiz. Remember, if you missed that episode, go back and have a listen to hear that The Wiz was ready to close until their ad campaign. Right.
Yeah.
So it definitely happens. So at any rate, Alfred Urey then writes The Robber Bridegroom, which is a 1975 adaptation of a story by Eudora Welty, the great Mississippi writer. I love her work, but he adapts that into a musical. And he writes some other things here and there, but he really hits it big when he starts writing his so-called Atlanta trilogy. Now, I don't know that he set out to write an Atlanta trilogy or if it just happened that way. You write what you know. And so it just happened that way. I do know August Wilson set out to write his Pittsburgh cycle, right? Yeah. Like that was the intent.
And how good it is.
Yeah. My gosh, I love his plays.
And
so much.
So tied to Pittsburgh and its geography and everything in it. I love plays like that, especially when you can like teach them where they're supposed to be, because it opens up a brand new world.
That's right, because this is Point Park is in Pittsburgh.
Exactly. So I got to teach the Pittsburgh cycle there. And like one of the things that I did was I gave everybody a bus ticket and I said, okay, go find his house, go find this, this character's house, go find this, go take a picture in front of it. And the experience that the kids came back with, they were like, I'm understanding now why this particular part feels or should feel more heavy than the part does, or whatever it is, just because of the geography of it. And it's like, I feel more caged in because of how everything is laid out in the city. Yeah. And I had one kid that came back and was like, you didn't tell us that to get up to August Wilson's house, there were 500 steps. he says, and he goes, and no buses run through his area. And I went, why do you think that is? And he went, oh my gosh. I was like, those are kinds of things that are great. What's great about this one is that this is the first time, I mean, I've been in Atlanta for 5 years now. This is the first time I've seen anything come through that has like the Atlanta ties.
Yeah.
Because this is, his Atlanta trilogy.
Yeah.
This is, this show makes so much more sense to me now that I've lived here.
Yeah, of course. Yes, absolutely. Well, let me take a moment for August Wilson. I know he's not a musical theater guy, so there's not really any way to justify cramming him into an episode,
but okay.
I love him. And I want to say, for those who don't know, in case you don't know, he did a cycle of 10 plays that covered the same neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And August Wilson dropped out of high school at what, 15?
Mm-hmm.
And he would go, and his mom thought he was going to school. Instead, he was going to the library because his teacher had told him he was dumb or something like that. And so he was
got in trouble.
Okay. Well, I knew there was something.
He didn't get in trouble. He got kind of pegged for something.
Accused of cheating, right? Or plagiarism?
Yeah.
That's right.
And he wasn't.
Right.
He was brilliant, but
obviously.
They didn't believe that because he was African American at that point. So
that's right. So instead of going to school, he leaves his house every day and goes to the library and teaches himself. And then
that library is still there.
Is it really? That's awesome.
It's still there, and it is kind of a shrine to him.
Yeah, of course.
Sent my students there. They walked in, started, and as soon as they got in, there was a big map of, August Wilson's, Hill District.
Yeah.
And they started taking pictures, and the librarian saw them taking pictures, came running. What are you doing? Well, we're doing an August Wilson scavenger hunt. And they're like, really? And they took them. They're like, this is where he used to sit between these two rows.
That is so awesome. I love that.
I love librarians.
Yes. No question. So he becomes one of the great playwrights. I mean, one of the greatest American playwrights to live and breathe. I mean, and writes this just absolutely iconic cycle of 10 plays. Then we see that template emulated by Dominique Morisseau, who writes a Detroit cycle. And I don't believe hers is 10 plays. I think it's 3. But nevertheless, she is a Broadway musical librettist. She did Ain't Too Proud, The Life and Times of the Temptations. But she did a cycle of plays about her hometown, which was Detroit. And then we see Alfred Ury years ago, after August Wilson had started his, but before Dominique Morisseau had started hers, doing the same thing with his Atlanta trilogy. So again, I don't know that he started out to do that, but that's what ends up happening. The first of those is called Driving Miss Daisy. Maybe you've heard of it.
Yeah.
He writes that play in 1987, and it is a story. You've probably seen the 1989 film if you haven't read the play, but the story focuses on a relationship of an elderly Jewish woman in Atlanta and her Black chauffeur. Played on film by Jessica Tandy and Morgan Freeman, very famously. And this is based really on his grandmother's life. So again, we're talking about writing what you know. He was writing what he observed. This play never makes it to Broadway, but it does play Playwrights Horizons, which is one of those companies that comes up a lot for the development of new musicals. And it wins a Pulitzer Prize for drama. And then the film adaptation wins an Academy Award
it won everything that year.
Yes, I remember.
It was all about Driving Miss Daisy.
Yes.
And
yes.
Yuri's paternal grandmother, her name was Lena Fox. So she's the inspiration for Miss Daisy. She had a friend that she used to play canasta with.
She did have a friend.
And her name was Mrs. Leo Frank.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So,
and we're coming to that.
We're seeing where you see these little threads.
We're getting
keep
there.
Going.
We're getting there. We're getting there. So Alfred Ury writes Driving Miss Daisy about his grandmother's relationship with her chauffeur. He then writes Last Night of Ballyhoo, which premieres on Broadway in 1997. Tracey, this play ran for a year and a half, like over almost 600 performances.
Y'all, plays don't do that.
No, they don't. No, they don't.
First run plays don't do that. I should probably say that one. They don't do that.
Yes. So Last Night of Ballyhoo premieres on Broadway in 1997, but it had been commissioned in 1996 by the Olympic Arts Festival. If you recall, the
For
Olympics in
Atlanta.
19, that's right, 1996 were in Atlanta. So where have we heard this story of an Olympic Arts Festival come up before on this podcast?
You know what? Something about the LA Olympics in
Yes,
84.
that's right.
And
That's right.
was it, I'm trying to think back. Was it the Lion King connection?
I believe it was
It was,
the Lion
okay.
King.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Remember, Julie Taymor, Thomas Schumacher
Yes.
was looking for people. Julie Taymor had done Liberties Taken in Massachusetts.
And they were like, yeah, we can't do this.
That's a little bit big for this, but I'm going to remember your name. And sure enough, he did as promised. So at any rate, Last Night of Ballyhoo commissioned the second play in the Atlanta trilogy. It focuses on the time, it was December of 1939 when Gone with the Wind is about to have its big Atlanta premiere in Midtown Atlanta. As you can imagine, I mean, they still talk about that premiere in Atlanta. I remember very vividly being in Atlanta and hearing about that, even though it was, 70 years later. And yet you have these members again of this Jewish community in Atlanta who are more concerned about this big event, the final, like a big cotillion event that's happening, the final social event of the season called Ballyhoo, right? Who's going to be at Ballyhoo, right? So that it's set in 1939, also in Atlanta. So like I said, it was commissioned for the Olympics, which were in the 1996 summertime Olympics in Atlanta, and staged at the Alliance Theater in Atlanta, which, by the way, another August Wilson connection. Wilson's play Jitney had its world premiere at the Alliance in probably 98. I was there opening night, and August Wilson sat right in front of me.
Are you serious?
He did. And my dad was
Amazing.
my date because
Yeah.
he loves theater too. And so I'm like, Daddy, that's August Wilson. Daddy, that's, like I'm freaking out. I'm so excited.
And Jitney is not one that we hear about a whole lot, but
it's brilliant.
So Jitney is based on a jitney in Pittsburgh was basically a taxi service for those in the Hill District because no public transportation. It all went around the hill.
Yes.
And it just kind of left them up there. And so the jitney station you would call, they would come get you, they would take you to wherever you needed to go, and then they would leave. It was kind of like a weird early Uber is essentially.
Yeah.
That jitney station is still there. My kids went to it, walked
Very
inside and said, I don't know what gave them the chutzpah to do, but they're like, anybody know August Wilson? And 6 people were like, we love August.
Oh my
here."
gosh, that's
so
awesome.
they're all still there. I think that's what's so great about these stories is that it is so interconnected.
Yes.
These are real people. And when you start realizing that what you're seeing on stage is, a person that Alfred Uri's like grandmother played canasta with,
Exactly.
like that just brings a whole new meaning to it when they become so real. That's why I love these kinds of like city cycles.
Right. And that's why they say, write what you know, right? I mean, all 3 of these playwrights have had great success writing what they knew and writing about their hometowns and, their own experience, their grandparents' experience. I think, is Jitney the 70s, the 1970s? Is that where it falls? I feel like that's where it falls in the cycle. The Wilson cycle is one play for every decade of the 20th century. And I believe Jitney was the 70s. Regardless, it's brilliant. They're all brilliant, as are Alfred Uri's plays. So after it premieres at the Alliance Theater in Atlanta as part of the Olympic Arts Festival in 1996, The Last Night of Ballyhoo transfers to Broadway, opens in February of 1997. It's nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It does not win like Driving Miss Daisy had. I will tell you from having done a lot of research on the Pulitzer Prize, very often a play may be deemed worthy of a Pulitzer, but if someone's already won the Pulitzer, and certainly if they've won it recently, they won't re-award to the same person. Even if it was probably, I don't know if it was or not, but even if it could arguably be the best play of the year, they'll say, well, he just won last year. Let's give somebody else a chance. So, who knows what was at play there. I haven't looked into that, but I do know it was nominated. And while it doesn't win the Pulitzer Prize for drama, it does win the Tony Award for best play. So it does get its accolades. Now listen to this cast. It stars Dana Ivey And in addition to that, Jessica Hecht, who at the same time was on Friends as the partner of Ross's ex-wife Susan. Do you
Oh,
remember them?
yes,
What was
yes,
that?
yes,
What's her
yes,
name?
yes. Is
I
that
can't
what her
remember her
name is?
name. Susan was Ross's ex. Wait, is that
Yeah.
right? Regardless,
Yes. No,
she
well,
was,
I know who you're talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Jessica Hecht, and Paul Rudd. Jessica Hecht and Paul Rudd both in their Broadway debuts. So, like I said, this show ran for 556 performances, which is outrageous for a play. It finally closed in June of 1998. So it was running concurrently with Parade, which of course forms the third leg in that Atlanta trilogy. Okay, so let's talk about Parade. Obviously, we know it tells the story of Leo Frank. We know the story of Leo Frank now. But let me tell you, Tracy's already alluded to this. Um, Yuri had a vested interest in the story because his grandmother was friends with Lucille Frank, Leo's widow. But in addition to that, his
Hmm.
great uncle owned the National Pencil Factory where Leo Frank was the manager. So there were a number of ways, in
Hmm.
addition to just being a part of the Atlanta Jewish community, that Yuri had grown up baked in this story, right? He had heard it from the time he could hear. He had heard about Leo Frank from family members, from community members. He knew it very, very well.
He
And
also says that they were reluctant to talk about it with
yeah,
him. And somebody told him one time he started asking questions because somebody brought something up and said something, and he says, and I was watching as a young kid, and someone in the room got upset, stood up, and walked out of the room. And
wow.
he knew something was weird, and he asked,
Yeah.
I don't know if it, I think it might have been his grandparents, like, what was that about? It's like, it's a very sad story. You should really look it up sometime if you want to know more.
Yeah.
Which is a way of kind of going, kiddo, I don't want to talk about this
Talk
right
about it
now.
when you're older.
And he
Yeah.
says, I went straight to the library and I read about Leo Frank that day and
Yeah.
figured out what happened. So it
Yeah.
was still very raw, you know? And
Yeah.
so
Oh, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So in the early 1990s, so this is before even it's after Driving Miss Daisy, but before Last Night at Ballyhoo, he's talking to the great Hal Prince. We've talked about him. I'm not going to spend any time on him other than to give the headline of most Tony Awards in history. I think he's at 21. He's called the Prince of Broadway. We have spent a lot of time talking about him, so I won't belabor that point. But he mentions to Hal Prince, who's a producer and director and has been working on Broadway at this point since 1948. He says to him, the Leo Frank story. And how Prince, who did not grow up in Atlanta, who grew up in New York, is like, what?
Huh? What's that?
Like you're gonna have to tell me more about that. And after Yuri tells Prince about it in the early 1990s, Prince says, oh, wait, that's a musical. And so they begin to develop this show as a musical. But of course, the first question is who's going to write the music? So they initially pitched the idea to Stephen Sondheim, who for a time is attached to the project, but he ends up dropping out because, as he says, he didn't want to do another dark musical. Just
Well,
made me laugh
yeah.
to read that. But he'd just done Passion, which was especially dark, even for him. And so I think he needed a break from heavy, weighty subjects. Not
Hmm.
that I ever think of light subjects when I think of Stephen Sondheim, but
Yeah, but yeah,
but that
I
was
could
that
see
one.
why he's like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
can't do
just a
another
little bit
one.
too much, right? A little too much. So think of Passion coming out, I think 93, 94. That would have been the same time that they're approaching him to work on this project. And ultimately he decides, you know what, it's not for me. So Prince is left to decide who's going to write the music for this show, right? Now, to your point, Tracy, we'd lost a generation of musical
Hmm.
theater writers, right? To
Hmm.
the AIDS crisis. You've talked about that extensively in
Yeah.
previous episodes. So there weren't like great stalwart American creators of musical theater um, happening on Broadway. We're still in the era of the mega musical and the British invasion, as it's been called.
Disney.
So Yeah.
starting to
Yeah.
take
Disney's
over.
beginning.
And
That's exactly right. This is Beauty and the Beast takes premieres the following year. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So Prince begins to wonder if this young composer named Jason Robert Brown, and when I say young, I mean
he's very,
Pasek and Paul kind of young. We're
yeah,
talking
very young.
mid 20s. And he begins to wonder if this is the guy for the job. And let me tell you a little bit about Jason Robert Brown, and then I'll tell you how Prince even knew who he was, because it's a great story. So, Jason Robert Brown grew up in New York, Rockland County, New York, to be specific. He was a really gifted, from obviously a very early age, a very gifted kid, not only musically but also academically. He skipped a grade in the middle of elementary school, and as a result of that, he never really found his tribe, right? Because he was always, the youngest kid but also the smartest. So
Yeah.
he didn't,
You don't
we've
fit.
seen that play out
Yeah, I've seen
before.
that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've seen
And
that happen before.
yeah, right. It didn't really find a place for him, but when he was 8 years old, he did find himself. He asked for a piano because he wanted to grow up to be Billy Joel. And and so he got a piano, and as he begins to tickle the ivories, he finds it. Right. Suddenly everything makes sense to him. So he becomes just an avid pianist. And then he ends up going to Eastman School of Music in Rochester for a couple of years before dropping out to follow. From what I read, he followed a girlfriend to Miami. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but that is what I have read. So he chases a girl potentially to Miami, and becomes a teacher at a performing arts school there. And then not long after that comes back to New York, where he lives in the Village, and he starts supporting himself playing at piano bars, cabarets, wherever he can. And he starts writing some songs, right? He starts to put together some of his own numbers, and singers at these cabarets where he would play. One in particular was the 88's Club, would begin to perform his songs. Okay. So one night, a young lady named Daisy Prince was in the audience. Now, if you recognize the name Prince, it's because she is Hal Prince's daughter. So Daisy Prince is in the audience, and she loves what she hears, and she connects with Brown after the show, and then begins developing these songs that he has written that she had heard performed. She begins developing them into, it's not really a review. It becomes called a song cycle. And so, which has become, we hear that phrase a lot now. I don't think we heard it as much in the early 90s as we do now. But she develops a song cycle of music written by Jason Robert Brown. And that song cycle, Tracey, might be familiar to a lot of people. It's called Songs for a New World.
For a New World. It was actually, we ended up scrapping our whole season, obviously, during the 2020 pandemic.
Yeah.
And we had to find something where, here were the rules. During the pandemic, we still had to do a musical because the students paid for an academic experience.
Right.
Kristin. Right. We had to do it. But no student could be within 10 feet of each other on stage during the performance.
Yes.
So we decided to do Songs for a New World because it was all very self-contained. And the only time we had more than one person on stage was like in like two different songs, and then like the connecting material.
Yes.
So then, I'm on stage with my rope of 10 feet going nose to nose with these kids being like, all right, do not get any closer than that. You stand right there.
Right. That's awesome. That's a perfect choice. That's a perfect choice.
For New World, it's difficult. It's challenging.
Yeah.
It's got some beautiful ideas in it. It's not like it's not a fully cohesive anything really, but it's like every song, every little, vignette, you're just kind of like, wow.
Yeah.
There's something here. Like there's a whole world in this song.
Yeah.
And I think that's what draws, I know, Daisy Prince to it, but that's what kind of convinces Hal after a while. Cause I don't think as my remembrance was that he was not on board at first. He was like, well, what are you doing?
Yeah, right.
Is that, there's a world inside this kiddo's head. So
yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So this show, there's a workshop of it in Toronto. It then opens off Broadway in October of 1995 at the WPA Theater. Listen to this cast. And this is a four-man show, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you perform it as a four-man show? Is that pretty
I mean,
standard?
of course not.
Yeah.
Of course we did not. I had to give 250 students the same education they would be getting if we were allowed to be in person.
Yes. Fair.
So no.
Very fair. Very fair. Well, this originally was a four-person cast, and listen to three of the four people who are names we all know: Billy Porter, Jessica Malasky, and Brooks. And I cannot say his last name, but it starts with Ashmankis. Do you know how to say it? He's in several shows that I love. He is hilarious. Most recently in The Prom on Broadway, he was so freaking good in it. So I don't know that he'll ever hear this podcast, but if he does, 3 million apologies for how I've butchered your name, because you certainly deserve more respect.
So good.
Yes, it's not, it's no shade, Brooks. You're amazing. I just cannot pronounce your last name, so I'm so sorry. So, Songs for a New World obviously gets some attention, right? And it still plays. 2020 Tracey directed it, but it still plays all over the place. It's an incredible cycle of songs. And eventually, after Sondheim drops out, Hal Prince remembers this guy that Daisy had worked with, and he decides he's going to talk to Brown. And so he calls Brown, has a conversation with him, tells him about the project, describes what the story is, what they're hoping to do with the show, and then he asks Jason Robert Brown if he's interested in doing it. And Brown said, "I'm sorry? Is there a question?"
Is that a question? Like, am I interested? Yes. Like, that's not a question you need to ask.
Right. If Hal Prince calls, you say yes. And I think this is really interesting because, of course, because he was so young, Prince took a lot of heat for this. But when you look at Prince's career, he was 20 some years into his career when he worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber, who was the same age. Yeah. Stephen Sondheim was not much older than this when Hal Prince came alongside him for some of those early shows like Company and Follies. And so he had done this before. He had championed young voices throughout his career in the same way, Tracey, George Abbott, who was his mentor, had championed his own, right? So he really pays forward what Abbott gave to him.
That generation knew mentorship, and that mentorship was kind of going on. It was being passed down.
Yeah,
it's like exactly. You think about Abbott to Prince, or even Hammerstein to Sondheim, and that kind of mentorship that goes on, and then I think we kind of broke a generation in there. It doesn't happen as much anymore. But
I agree.
It's that kind of mentorship that gets your brain into, I need to have something that will fill the space when I retire, rather than I need to make as much money as possible.
Right.
I can't afford to take that risk.
Right.
Right. That's what mentorship does, I think.
And we see Sondheim as everybody's mentor, right? I mean, he would help anybody who reached out to him.
And he did a beautiful job of it. And he talks a lot about, he's like, I just want to make sure that Ak is proud of me, that I've given back what he gave him. And I love when he says that kind of stuff, because you're like, Steve, Ak is very proud. Don't
That's right. That's right.
You are arguably probably more successful than he even was. But because you have been such an exemplary student and given credit back to him and back to him and back to him, and then paid it forward. Yeah. We're never going to forget Hammerstein either. No. That's the beauty of mentorship. That's exactly right. When it works well, it works beautifully.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't see it often, though I am reminded of our conversation about Pasek and Paul, right? Mm-hmm. Remember Jeff Whitty, Avenue Q, seeing it in Pasek and paying Paul, right? That betting Paul that $7,000, seeing that in him and spending time helping them. And we don't see it so much. And I don't know why that is, and it's probably a conversation for another day. But nevertheless, it was something that Prince had done often because it was done to Prince by the great George Abbott.
And it turns out when you bet on a kiddo,
it works out.
It does work out sometimes.
It does work out sometimes.
Trust your gut.
Yeah, that's right. So they get to work on this musical in the mid 1990s. It's Alfred Urey to write the book, Hal Prince to direct, and Jason Robert Brown to write the music and lyrics. And it was really hard going for Jason Robert Brown in one particular way. As we've already discussed, he knew the different musical styles, and that came pretty easily to him. I mean, he was, a competent, and I don't mean competent in a disparaging way. I mean, he was competent enough musician that he could do all those things. Right. Exactly.
He's incredible.
Exactly. So I don't use that disparagingly at all. It's just the word that comes to mind to say he could do it all. Right. Like that was no problem, but he did have a big problem connecting with his protagonist. The character of Leo Frank was very, very difficult for him to write. In fact, he said that he understood him socially and politically, but he did not get him personally. Prince once described Leo Frank as persnickety, anal, humorless, and didactic. And if you see the show, I mean,
and they sympathize him a lot though in the show.
Yes, they do.
That probably is in, probably Jason Robert Brown being like, I can't, if I did persnickety, we would hate him.
We would hate him.
How do we tell that story and make, I know that's actually what happened, but that's not musical theater.
Right.
So it's
he can't be sympathetic.
That's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. He had a very hard time with that. It wasn't until Brent Carver came in, who originated the role on Broadway and who had won a Tony Award for Kiss of the Spider Woman, that he began to click with the character. So he sees Brent Carver at an early workshop and he's like, okay, suddenly I get it. And he could see the sympathetic side of Leo Frank that he couldn't see before because Frank was so stoic, right? In his mind. So he begins to, as they're workshopping it, which is why they workshop, he begins to unpack this character of Leo Frank. Now, also, in addition to Brent Carver in that original company, we have Carolee Carmello as Lucille, who is currently touring in Kimberly Akimbo.
No way.
Yes.
Which is
the topic of next week's episode. So, Carolee Carmello played Lucille Frank in this original Broadway production. Now, this production, Tracy, I'm going to blow your mind. This production cost $5 million. In 1998, December of 98, when it premiered. That's the modern equivalent of $9 million.
That's small. That's small.
Yeah,
but
real small.
It's very small. I know we're talking about big numbers, but I always am just like, oh dear.
That feels like nothing. That feels like going through your couch cushions to get change for Taco Bell in 1998. You know what I mean?
Well, because there's that sliding scale, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's like, can I do, we can do a full-fledged show, like Broadway level as far as costume and scenery and all of that kind of stuff, at a school, maybe not the same kind of talent wise, because we don't have to pay talent, but we can, do that kind of stuff, and we can spend, $25,000 on it. But that's not a few million. It's when you start adding all of the costs of people to it. That's what really starts being expensive. But the thing is that that's just nothing.
Right.
As far as kind of what, you also have to realize that he has a seasoned musical theater production team.
Yeah, that's true.
And they're all there, and they're all, it's like, what part of that is paying the team that puts all of this together? Is it paying the team? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of sliding scale issues that you talk about, but that is absolutely nothing.
For comparison, I'm not positive, but I think the number we gave for The Lion King, which
Oh
premiered
gosh.
97, was 30 million, right?
Yeah,
And granted, they're
yes.
very different shows, but that just shows you how 5 million is a drop in the bucket.
But the scope was very different.
Yeah,
You know,
obviously, yes, very different shows.
but I mean,
But
how
that's
do I
why
say
our
this?
reaction to 5 million is like, oh,
That's just
let me write you a
nothing.
check, you know?
The thing is that this this first production of Parade did do kind of bigger sets and bigger. It was
did.
trying to give the weight of the story through like height and scenery and that kind of stuff, which is not what you're getting in this revival at all. But it was much bigger in scope, as I remember the pictures, because I did not see it. But I remember looking at the pictures and all of that kind of stuff that it was trying to be a little bigger, and they still did it on $5 million. So
I think things were just bigger in general back then. I don't think
yeah.
we hadn't yet had that return to intimacy, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, and
Everything was
the advent of the chamber musical that
right,
was coming, right?
right,
Because they
right.
were getting even more expensive to produce.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but not this one.
not this one.
Not this one. So it premieres, as I said, in December of 1998 at the Lincoln Center Theater, Vivian Beaumont, to be specific. There at Lincoln Center, it's nominated for 8 Tonys, wins 2, including Best Book and Best Score. It does not win Best Musical at this
No.
point. It loses to Fosse, which I'll
It
be
loses
honest,
to Fosse.
I was shocked Fosse was even up there for Best Music. I mean,
But
I
why?
love Fosse, but
Let's talk about the psychology of Tony voters for a minute.
well, yeah.
Why
fair.
is that?
Well, because we'd had Chicago in 96, and so everybody's Fosse, 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 and then Fosse gets his own review. So it does I understand that, but it is a review. It is not a story, right? It
And
is a straight up review.
and if everybody's very Fosse, like resurgence of Fosse,
Yeah.
tunnel vision at the time, they recognize that this is a work of art over here at the Lincoln Center, but gosh, it's dark.
Yes, it is.
And I had way more fun at Fosse.
Yeah, right. It's true.
There are rarely times where I disagree with Tony voters. And this is one of the times that I kind of disagree with them. But, yeah. I mean, like, I didn't even disagree with them during Wicked.
Yeah. Oh,
Believe it or not. Do I think that Wicked is a great musical? And is it watershed? Did it deserve a Tony Award for Best Musical? Of course it did. But that next to Avenue Q, which won, that really does kind of revolutionize how we satirize, like how we use that mirror. It changes how we use the mirror. That reflects culture back to itself. And I think that one is going to end up being just as important.
yeah.
But yeah, this is one where I'm like, Tony voters, were you just like, that's too sad? Like,
Yeah.
really? Because you obviously gave it to hit, like, you were like, this was very good. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But I just,
Yeah.
no, put something fun down in the top category.
Yeah.
You don't want
Yeah.
people flocking to that. They'll never come back,
Right. It's true. And, to your point, the show only played 85 performances.
It was very short run.
It was very, very, very short run. But it solidified Jason Robert Brown as a musical theater heavyweight. And in fact, Prince said of their collaboration, he said, he's staggering and I want to spend the next 10 years working with him.
Yeah.
So, mission accomplished in terms of introducing new talent.
What did you think when it closed?
I was not surprised.
Yeah.
When I saw it, now, granted, I was a college senior who didn't know like 1/10 as much as I thought I knew.
But you thought you knew something.
I did think I knew. I probably thought I knew more than I think I know now.
Yeah.
At almost 50.
Which is always the way of it.
Yeah, right. But I was not surprised. It was hard to watch. It is hard to watch. And to your point, a lot of us, me included, do not go to musical theater, for hard to watch.
Yeah.
Why is The Drowsy Chaperone my favorite show? Because it ain't hard to watch.
It's so fun. There are people on
so
roller
freaking
skates.
fun.
There's like, yeah.
So freaking fun. And P.S. one act.
Well, yeah. There you go.
But it was very
90
hard
minutes,
to watch.
no intermission. Those are
Right.
that's
The
what
best.
Caroline says. Those are the best words in
Let's
musical theater.
mainstream that. Can we mainstream that? But yeah, I mean, I was not surprised. I was sad for, I'd followed the development of it. Again, I knew the song because of, Audra McDonald's album. So I had there used to be a magazine that I read voraciously back then called In Theater, which was like People magazine for theater for Broadway. Man, I would give anything. I mean, now we get it instantly with social media, but it was so fun to wait to get that magazine in the mail, And so I had followed it and knew the players just by name from following that way. Then, of course, had met one of the members of the original company just through a connection with my dad, who had been so hospitable to me. So I was sad, but not surprised, because it's just hard to watch. It's just, it's uncomfortable. I keep thinking of The Diary of Anne Frank, and there's a lot of thematic overlap between those two, but the inevitability of the very painful end makes for a difficult, not enjoyable evening in the theater.
Yeah, it's
and so many people
go work through.
Yeah, you do. So many people are wanting enjoyable evenings in the theater.
Yeah.
So this did not offer that.
It closes after 85 performances, and I had the same reaction you did, but of course, being on the West Coast, you don't have access to things right away.
Right.
At that point, had heard there was this thing called Parade in there, obviously, because we did have access to the Tony Awards, so we could see that. We could see what was going on there.
Yeah.
But knew it had closed, got the CD, started listening to it, and thought the same thing. Was like, this is a modern masterpiece,
right?
Dude. Like, this is amazing. Right. This is gonna go down and like. But I remember thinking, this feels to me like the folk opera in 1935.
Porgy and Bess.
Porgy and Bess. It felt like Porgy and Bess to me. I was like, this is going to be that one-off, isn't it? I'm just like, look where we are. We're coming back around in my little circle here. Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh. But what was interesting to me is that I really thought it would kind of die out, like the Broadway cognizance of it or whatever, like over time, that it would be like this little thing that was like only you and I would know.
Yeah.
But it developed this huge following. And I wonder how much 9/11 is part of that, because it's like having to deal, if you think about like kind of the psychology of population, like having to deal with the hard things all of a sudden and finding ways to do that. Because, I mean, we didn't all get to go to therapy after 9/11, after our country was attacked. And that changed all of us, no matter where we were. It changed our feel of safety or whatever it is. But I always just kind of come back to that and go, I wonder how much of it is just like all of a sudden we were a little bit more open to musicals that had to deal with hard things. And look, there were times in our history where they had to deal with hard things too. And maybe there's more hope in it. I've always just kind of searched for an answer from that. That's the best thing I can come up with. The fact that then 25 years later, we bring it back.
Yeah.
At a time where I don't think it would have, I was like, this is not going to work right now.
Yeah.
And it does.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I'm thinking you're talking about hard things in musicals. And I thought of course, there's many, many others, but I thought of Miss Saigon and how that played forever. And what was the difference? Was it just the spectacle that kept people, why did people flock to that? Which I don't even like to watch that show. I think it is so sad. It breaks my heart. So I've left at intermission more than once of that show because I don't want to watch the second act.
Yeah. I think there's two things
coming.
There. So I think there's two things there. One, there's a helicopter that lands
on stage. The spectacle. Yeah, the spectacle. Yeah, exactly.
First and foremost.
Yeah.
Second, it is a much more nationally focused musical, even though it's British, right? Because you have an experience that has been shared by people all over the country in
That's
Vietnam.
a great point. Yep.
The thing is that you're dealing with like everybody in every single state. The issue with parade is that this is very regionalized, right?
Micro. You're right. And that's a great point.
I think it's the telling of Vietnam. And, you know, those, I have several uncles and, you know, cousins twice removed or whatever that went to Vietnam and what, you know, now with my almost 50-year-old mindset, looking back and watching that they were having to work through all of that over their lives. And then we get to the 90s, which, you know, is 15 years after most of them have come home. And, you know, finally getting the ability for people around them to realize what it was like, what they left behind.
Yeah.
That's you know, those kinds of things, you know, that's in a whole nother conversation when you talk about Vietnam and how Vietnam vets were treated when they came home, and versus now there's a musical that's really cool to watch, and you can get people in the door by being like, there's a helicopter that lands on stage.
I stay for the helicopter and then I bolt before the second act.
You're like, no. But then, you know, in the second act, when they're watching this and they're having to realize this is what people left behind. This is the kind of mental, like the mental health struggles these guys had to do it basically alone. Like, I think it opens some eyes there. And I think that it just plays better across the US at that particular time because it is more nationalized.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. But at any rate, closes after not too long a run in 98, and then, or I'm sorry, 99, opens in 98.
Parade does.
Yes, Parade closes in 99.
Moving back to Parade. Yeah, right. This is what happens when Tracey doesn't look at Kristin's notes ahead of time. She doesn't have, did you not put them in there either?
Oh, no, they're in there.
Oh, you did? In there. Okay, see, I was just a bad podcast host today, and I did not look at them. So we have been going on bunny trails today.
They got put in about literally 2:30 a.m. So you would not have had an opportunity to see them. But at any rate,
I didn't put my notes in either. I'm like scrolling over here. I'm like, ooh, we have the same note.
Yeah. So the revival, you know, like Tracey said, the songs, some of them leap out into the you know, kind of the repertoire, because there's some beautiful, beautiful music. And the show makes its return in March of 2023. Of course, the music is the same, but there is a different director. Michael Arden takes the helm of the revival, and it marks Ben Platt's first role on Broadway post Dear Evan Hansen. Yeah. So his return to Broadway, he plays Leo Frank. He says he's grown up listening to this music, you know, so he thinks that now the time is right? Like maybe if we weren't ready in 1998, 99, for all the reasons and more that we have discussed and that Tracey's pointed to, we're ready now. We're ready for this show. And in fact, the show, which did not win Best Musical in 1998, does win Best Revival in 2023. And it's now touring the country. Obviously, it's been in Atlanta recently, but it'll be coming soon to a town near you if it hasn't already been there.
And just so you know, when you go see this, is a very, very different staging setup than you know, the first run around. This particular production uses a lot more projections of newspaper clippings, like so we're seeing that aspect of it. And these are the real things from Atlanta, from Mariana. Like they're using that kind of projection on the screen. So all of a sudden it's becoming very obvious that this is something very real, and we're having to deal with it on a media, you know, our voracious appetite for media. Like now we're having to see it. They also don't do, I think, as much of the kind of more horrific things that happen in there. They try not to do that as kind of, you know, part of live action. They're doing it with Basically, they make them human shadow puppets. And so you see it up on the screen. So it's done kind of with projection, kind of with lighting and everything.
Yeah.
So that it's like what you see is, just the black and white outlines of people. It changes things. And then everybody's sitting on stage. It's not like they're leaving or going. It feels a little like Our Town. When I first saw the setup of it, I was like, why does it look like Our Town with everybody sitting in a circle and everybody on stage? And this is a little weird. And, I'm like, okay. But this is a very, very different show than the first time around. It is, I think, more aware of how disturbing and how much work it takes to sit through.
Yeah.
I think in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, you're rewarded with a brilliant score. But it is one of those shows that you gotta unpack on the way home. You don't go out, it doesn't give you a little tune to carry with you when you go as the drowsy chaperone, but you are having conversations as you leave. Once the stunned silence abates, then you begin to talk because you gotta process.
The thing that I would like more than anything is I would like the social media and Google data on that area around the theaters when the show's let out.
Oh, because you think people are Googling what?
Oh my goodness. Whenever there's something that I was like, what is this? And where is this? And I was like, I want to know how many people are Googling Mary Fagan.
That's a very good
and
point.
like, is this real? Is this actually real? And everything like that. And, I see that as, that's what good art does.
It does.
That's what it does.
It does.
It makes you think. It makes you go get more information.
It does. I agree with that. That's very true. Very true.
I don't think they all need to be this heavy to do that. But
no,
this one does do that.
It does do that. It does do that. So, and there is a place for it. Mm-hmm. So now you know what to expect when Parade comes to your town. And that will do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in next time when we'll be talking about Kimberly Akimbo, which, like Parade, also won its Tony Award in 2023. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast.